This is the podcast of INCACT, the European Network on Cultural Management and Policy. In this series, we interview extraordinary professionals from the cultural management and policy community. Join us to hear their stories, the secrets of their success, and their advice for creating innovation by inspiring new policies and practices in the cultural, education, and research sector.
Today's episode will focus on European networks. In 2022, INCACT celebrates its 30th anniversary. The Congress has offered INCACT the opportunity to reflect on this important milestone and to give the voice to its members and partners to talk about the impact of cultural networks in making the cultural sector more sustainable and resilient. To learn more about this specific topic in this new episode, I have invited Carlotta Scioldo, who has recently finished its PhD exactly on the topic of network. Good morning, Carlotta. Could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
I'm Carlotta Scioldo, and I have recently defended my PhD thesis at the Inter-University Department of Regional and Urban Studies and Planning, which is a joint structure between Polytechnic and the University of Turin.
Could you please tell us why did you get interested in researching about European translational networks?
My research interest for European transnational network stem both from my professional practice, having worked in the European cultural policy environment and in one of the Creative Europe network, as well as from academic studies on cultural policies and European cultural policies. Coming also from the practice, the artistic practice, more specifically performing art, I have always been curious how intermediary structure like network work, how they connect the sector, the artistic sector, the cultural sector with the institution, how they transform languages and concern. And this is where my research interest emerged. Then I was also analytically very interested in better understanding how soft policies, like the cultural one, operate and what their impact on the ground are. In fact, these non-binding policies, they rely on instruments that require governance instruments like network, that require for the voluntary engagement of actors, both to shape the policies and then to implement it on the ground. So network, on the one hand, they support the implementation of the European cultural policy with its priority, discourse, practices on the ground across Europe. But simultaneously also, they allow to represent the cultural actor and the sector in the European policy arena. So to say that this instrument seems almost invisible, but instead are really fundamental for the creation, maintenance, and the democratic legitimation of the policy as such.
You have recently defended your PhD thesis on the role of European transnational networks in the digital transformation through COVID-19 emergency. Could you please tell us more about it? What are the main questions?
My PhD work is entitled Transnational Networks Between Global Governance and Local Changes in the Cultural and Creative Sector. If not harmonizing policies, then what? In the title, the underpinning question of my work is already present, which is what transnational networks do in the cultural and creative sector if they do not harmonize in policies. In fact, if we study other transnational networks operating in other policy sectors, for example, environmental issues, and the network of municipality and city, literature outlined that their main objective is harmonizing policy across Europe. But this is not the case for the transnational network in the European cultural policies. And this really depends from the mandate of the policy as such. So my research question really raised from this specific aspect. What are networks for if they do not harmonize in policies? This was for sure a provocative question, but it has also theoretical, empirical, and operational implications that I have discussed along my work. Another relevant issues which I have addressed through my research is the relationship between the different levels which are involved in the transnational network. I have outlined mostly three diverse levels: the level of European institution, the intermediate level of the network, composed of the executive office and the board of directors, so the representative part, the representative body, and finally the membership, which is composed of the diverse actors operating on the ground in the cultural sector in the diverse cultural organization across Europe. Analytically, I have tried to find ways to study how these three diverse levels interact, what does this interaction produce, and what their impact are. I have mobilized studies on Europeanization from public policy discipline to do so. And the employment of this discipline in the study of cultural networks strongly informed my inquiry, my research design, the methodology that I use, and surely the outcome of the research. But I really strongly believe that this is the innovative apport that this research can bring to the studies of European cultural policies.
How has the COVID context impacted the work of European Cultural Network and at the same time the delivery of their activities?
If we ask ourselves how COVID impacted the work of transnational network, we have, and their activity, we have to unfold different reflection. The cultural sector, as of course many other sectors, have been tremendously impacted and damaged by the pandemic. The cultural structure closed down immediately, and they have been very busy with their own organization to try to understand how to maintain the work of their employee, of the associated artist, of how to not lose totally the audience, how to possibly transforming what was possible into digital means. And the role of the network in this moment of crisis became even more evident. The role of the network as a connector, as an information provider, as a reference point, as a facilitator of transformation. Network play a fundamental role in keeping the cultural sector connected at the European scale when theater, cultural organization, museum shut down and artistic mobility was not possible anymore. They have been able to launch different surveys to measure the impact and the challenges and the problem that cultural organization and cultural actor had to face. They were able to propose a solution to face these new challenges. And lastly, they really work as a facilitator for a quick digital transformation. Transnational network, of course, they transform themselves, both their structure and their activities into digital format and means, but also simultaneously they try to support their member in this transformation, providing them tools, vocabulary, exchange of practice, contact, support. And not least, of course, they raise the voice of the cultural sector in the policy environment as well. So during the pandemic, the role of the network has been even more clearer for many stakeholders as a very important information provider for the sector, as a relevant reference point for the diverse cultural environment, but also as a facilitator in this case of digital transformation, for example, which was also a policy priority. So the role as a connector, horizontal and vertical, emerged even more clearly. And we can even dare to say that somehow there has been a renaissance of the role of a transnational network in this period of crisis, and also the duties of harmonizing emerged among the different tasks of the network.
How have European networks transformed this specific context of COVID in an opportunity?
Of course, the COVID pandemic period was enormous challenges, but as mentioned before, the role of network really emerged as fundamental and as more evident and clear than in other moments. They really work as a connector horizontally across membership and vertically across diverse level of government, being these the local, regional, national, and European. Also, by doing so and by really covering a role of a feedback from the sector and from the European institution, the legitimacy of the network has been reinforced.
What are the challenges that, in your view, networks are facing nowadays or are going to face in the future?
The challenges that the network are facing nowadays and are going to face in the near future are surely many, but I would underline a main one, that is maintain their own legitimacy, maintain the relevance of their own work, render this relevance evident for the different stakeholder and audience with whom they relate with, for example, the European institution, the membership, the cultural sector, stakeholder, external stakeholder, beyond the cultural sector as such. The challenges of the cultural sector also rapidly and constantly are changing. So also the network has constantly to reinform and reinvent themselves. And this is one of the reasons why this structure, even though on one hand they of course became over the time more institutionalized also within the European cultural policy arena, on the other they have to remain agile, fast to reply, connector, innovative, where practice can be experimented. And then lastly, one ongoing challenges of network, also in more practical term, is to keep on maintaining an active and engaged membership.
Do you think that there is a difference across regions?
The challenges that the network are going to face in the near future are surely connected with the balance between the virtual and live event and practices. There are for sure to balance between the attention to a European level and attention to local needs. So a network should reinvent himself also in this term, like to create a dissemination strategy, to work on different cluster on the ground, to experiment different practices on the ground, to have maybe local branches and organization. Many networks are experimenting on this emphasis on the local level, both in terms of discourse, narrative, but also structurally, how to restructure a network that can be very close to the local and very quick to reply to local needs. The difference across the region can be considered, of course, a challenge, but it's also a strength of Europe as such, and therefore also of a network. The diversity creates context-based knowledge, which of course impact how different policies, discourse, and practices are implemented in the diverse context. But such a diversity is a richness that should be maintained. It is very interesting to see how an experimented practice experienced maybe in Brussels would have totally different result and totally different dynamic in a tiny village in Spain or in Finland. But this exchange and this translation is also the challenges and the richness of those networks. However, I would like to underline here how this diversity and how ideas, policies, experimented practice travel across Europe is a challenge to be studied analytically. As mentioned before, I have tried to do so with the support of Europeanization studies and public policy debate. And I really think that to employ public policy literature for the study of cultural policies, practices, and governance, it will really open very relevant research agendas.
And more in general, what are nowadays the two most important challenges for the cultural sector and how European cultural networks can help to face these challenges?
I would reply to this question with something more generally, which concerns the positioning of culture within the wider framework of policies and more specifically of European policies. Culture has almost always covered a delicate and liminal position. On the one hand, culture has to advocate for its own existence by rendering more evident and by diffusing the awareness of the wide benefit the cultural and cultural sector and a cultural dimension has on other cross-sectorial sector, on the social, cultural, economic, and innovative sphere. However, another work that always requires attention from cultural network and cultural advocate is to keep on maintaining the high attention on creating endemically and structurally fair condition for the cultural sector to keep on existing and to keep on maintaining, researching, producing, and delivering. To never also lose the final aim, which is support the cultural sector, cultural operator, cultural production. Yes, to reach a sustainability, but a sustainability in a different realm, of course, environmental, but also economic and social and cultural of the people working in the cultural and creative sector. And also to maintain and to defend the core cultural activities of this sector. How transnational networks help the cultural sector to find innovative solutions. It occurs through many different dynamics, but I would mention the two main ones, which are learning and exchange of practice. These two terms, beside being very much studied in a public policy debate, are dynamics that occur on a daily basis in cultural networks. These dynamics create exchange, produce leverage new knowledge, and also the dissemination of new knowledge in different contexts. But what also networks do, they create a coalition among actors regarding certain emergent issues, discourse, concern, and narrative. And they also are able to value and scale up experiment that has been maybe tried out on the ground. And the network are a facilitator of diffusing this experiment across Europe and beyond. Innovation is nothing different than a new combination of something that already existing, being this a practice, a policies, a discourse, an idea, a narrative in one specific place, maybe taking place in another context. And this would almost surely creating innovative approach.
What do you consider the most important added value of European networks?
The most important added value of European networks is belonging. Is belonging to a community. Is belonging to an imaginative community, which is the European one, a cognitive community, a structural community, an economic community, and a community of practice, very relevant when we are referring to the cultural and creative sector. And this belonging should never be given by granted. This belonging is also shaped by a long legacies that network put in place. Most of the long-lasting network are existing now since 30 years, and they have produced a way of encountering, a way of working together, a way of belonging, practice, narrative terms. These are legacies that has to be very much valued for and respected. Also, network give the possibility to providing a voice to a sector that otherwise would even remain more invisible and probably less relevant on a wider policy arena. And lastly, transnational network, they provide spaces also for antagonist discourse, for negotiation, for interaction, for real democratic and democratic legitimation and interaction.
How, in your opinion, could or should European translational networks develop, or what is something that you'd like to see more of?
If we are talking more about the European transnational network development, I would really mention that the key is the awareness of the potentiality of the network as a structure. Network cover very delicate position between the cultural sector and the European institution, but also across many diverse level of governance. And this position is fundamental to maintain a sector alive, in negotiation, engaged, and democratic. This awareness of this positioning, however, should be more diffuse also in the membership itself. Network cannot be only considered as an event or activity where networking occur, which is also a fundamental activity that of course occur, but networks are much, much more than this. And we have seen their function clearly in the period of the pandemic, for sure. We can learn from this moment. We can exploit further this potentiality. And one last point of the development of a transnational network is local anchoring, is dissemination, is organization, is having a strong emphasis on the local and on the diverse local. And there also a cultural operator can be further empowered, meaning that a cultural operator can really start to think and envision themselves how they can make a use of Europe, how they can make a use of a network, how they can consider network as a leverage for something else beyond internationalization. So if all these three levels, the level of European Commission and the European institution, the level of network themselves and the membership are more aware of the potential of the that the network has and already experimented, I really think that there is a wonderful long path for new experience and experimentation.
What is your future research interest? Do you have already a new ambitious project to start in the next months?
My future research interest is also to continue as part of this research, because the topic of European transnational network have been very rarely examined in the academic debate referring to the cultural and creative sector. And this creates a strong void, a strong lack, both in the analytical term, but also on the operational term. And I strongly believe that more research on the topic can be highly beneficial both for the academic research in cultural policy, in European cultural policy, but also in evaluation studies, as well as for the practice of the networks and for their own development. For example, as a part of my research, I have developed a self-assessment tool for Creative Europe networks. for capture their operation both on the level of European policy and institution, their membership and the cultural sector more in general. This tool is very operational, also quite easy to be used, but it would not have been possible without a strong analytical set behind. And more generally, I really strongly believe in emphasizing also analytically and with economic debate on the fundamental role of intermediary bodies like structure in the EU governance. Their role is fundamental, as mentioned before, to maintain the cultural sector alive, sustainable, active, and most of all, democratic.
You have been listening to the podcast of INCACT, the European Network on Cultural Management and Policy. To learn more about us, our activities, and how to become a member, visit incact.org.